Good morning, everyone. Uh, Welcome back, and welcome to those who are just starting out here this morning in the Hondo. We are fortunate to have with us Matt Ogawa, who has organized this conversation, this important conversation about our response as Buddhists to the experiences of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I'd like to ask Matt if he would introduce this morning's program. If you would, please, Matt.
Thank you, Rinban. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Ogawa. If you don't know me, I am a member of the San Jose Betsumin and involved in a lot of other activities, both with our temple and in the local Japantown community here in San Jose. If you caught us, now it's been about a month, we had another one of these discussions with a guest speaker. And what we realized is we want to continue this conversation. I think, you know, when there were a lot of attacks happening, or May is in the US is recognized as Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, there was a lot of focus on Asian Pacific Islanders and you know, issues that were happening with us. But what we want to do is we want to continue the conversation and not just have it happen when an incident happens or incidents happen, and not just when it's a focus on our Heritage Month, but we want to do more throughout the year. So you'll see us continue these discussions. Before we get started with our panelists, I did want to thank several people who really helped make these discussions come to life. Of course, Rinban Sakamoto and Reverend Mikame for all of your support of what we were doing and really wanting us to engage with these discussions. Dennis Akizuki, Janice Doi, Mas Nishimura, Mitch Butler, and all of our panelists, as well as all of you for tuning in. I did want to remind you that if you're on YouTube, if you're viewing on YouTube, there's a live chat feature. And at any point throughout this discussion, if you would like to ask us a question or have us discuss something, the questions will be fed to us via a moderator, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. However, we're going to start with several pre-populated questions that we've received before the session. And now I want to get into introducing, our panelists, and I'll have them introduce themselves. And so just for, I'm going to just go in the order that you show up on my screen. And so we'll have Sydney, we'll have you introduce yourself. Then we'll go to Casey, and then we'll have Steve introduce yourself. And if you could just share, well, I already said your name, but you can share your name, your affiliation with Buddhism, and maybe what you do in your day job. So Sydney, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Hello, everyone. My name is Sydney Shiroyama. I grew up at the Palo Alto Buddhist Temple. My mom's side of the family is from Central California, so I have family at Visalia, Hanford, and Reedley temples. And my mom and my stepdad, Keiju Terada, go to Oakland Buddhist Church. And so growing up, I was pretty active with Dharma School and Junior YBA, and I did the YAC retreat, Youth Advocacy Committee retreat in 2007. And in college, I was involved with like Nikkei Student Union and Kyoto Taiko and Southern District Senior YBL. And so now, so now I'm involved with Techno Buddha. I'm the 2020 Techno Buddha co-chair, which seems to be a long term, but yeah. And then I am an occupational therapist, and so part of what I do with my occupational therapy practice is trying to integrate Taiko while working with children, and also I kind of collaborate with different Taiko groups to work on programming. So yeah, thank you for having me here.
Yeah, welcome, Sydney. Casey?
Hi, everyone. My name's Casey. I go by she, her pronouns. First off, I would also like to echo Matt's sentiments about just thanking everyone that's involved in the process, as well as my other two panelists. It's just an honor with all of you. Just to go into a little bit about myself, I grew up in the Central Valley, going to Fowler and Fresno Buddhist temples, where I participated in Junior YBA, as well as the YAC 12 year. Currently, I am in college. I was a part of also Nikkei Student Union, and that's where I joined college, which I'm part of as the president. I also do work with the Young Buddhist Editorial as the content and outreach coordinator, as well as the social justice committee chair. As far as my career goes, I just graduated from this year, my degree in sociology. Oh, thank you, thank you. And so right now I'm interning at the UC Berkeley University Development and Alumni Relations Office. So I'm hoping to do more work in nonprofit development.
Awesome, and congrats on your graduation.
Thank you, thank you.
All right, Steve.
Hey, I'm Steve Tamekuni. I also want to thank everyone for this opportunity. When I got your email, I was surprised to be included in this esteemed panel. So I was born and raised in San Jose. Grew up going to San Jose Buddhist Church, active in all the typicals, Boy Scouts, Junior YBA, Dharma School, all that. Been pretty religious, I would say, or try to be. I think it's weird to be like, to say you're super religious when you're Buddhist, because it's not as outwardly. But I mean, even from the beginning, I mean, my mom's side, they belong to the Higashi up in Berkeley. My dad's side, my grandfather was a minister in Hawaii, so it's pretty understood that I would be going to church from the beginning. But yeah, and then after high school, I was active in NSU. I went to UCSD. And then when I got back to the Bay Area, I got active in the Techno Buddha conference, helped out with that. And then in terms of career, I live and work in Santa Clara, and I'm a product designer at this company, cybersecurity company called Malwarebytes.
Awesome. Well, welcome. And I actually have had the pleasure of working in different ways with everyone on this panel. So it's exciting to be able to bring everyone together to have this discussion. I'm going to just jump right into the questions. And the first one, because this is our second session, for those of you that are watching, some of the questions will be the same as the last session because we feel it's kind of cool to get different perspectives on the same question. And then there'll be some new questions that were submitted to us. So the first one, and we don't all have to answer every question, but I actually would like to hear from everyone. And if you have an answer to this, if you don't, that's totally fine as well. But the first question really has to do with how you, if any of you or how each of you have dealt with maybe some anti-Asian sentiments in your life. And if so, what was your reaction? And the reason why we're asking this question is because we realize that anti-Asian sentiments show up in a lot of different ways. It's not always a direct, attack. It's not always someone, coming for you. But some of these things happen and they're maybe not noticed on the surface, but they're felt or noticed by you. And so we wanted just to hear what your thoughts are. For the sake of this question, we'll go in the same order that we did introductions in. Sorry, Sydney. But after that, we'll kind of popcorn around.
Okay, yeah. I think this is a really great question. I am multiracial, so I am half Japanese and half white, and so my experience as a person of mixed race is certainly different than my mom or Sorry, my cat is a bit louder.
That's all right. Your cat has a lot to say.
Yeah, she has input as well. So my experience as a mixed race person is of course different than my friends and family that are full Asian. And so, there are a unique set of challenges and also privileges. But as someone who is racially ambiguous, I realized that some people have a hard time interacting with me until they figure out which stereotype to implement. And so, growing up, I got a lot of questions from strangers, and even without really getting to know them, they kind of quickly jump into the question of what are you? Which to me tells me that they're probably craving this clarity and a need to racially categorize me. Whereas a person who is not of mixed race, they would just automatically implement those racial profiles. So I think that, it has been quite illuminating to see what processes that people carry, and
yeah, it's interesting. Just to kind of follow on to your question, do you you mentioned it a little bit, but do you find that once someone learns that you are biracial, they treat you maybe differently, or they sort of have this like, oh, okay, I get it now, type of a reaction?
Yeah, it's interesting to see because often people will tell me oh, I thought you were this, or like, oh, I don't see that much like Asian in you, or they'll tell me, I guess, like where like how I am did not meet, I guess, their assumptions, or like, and then of course I can't say like that they will treat me differently after they know, because I wouldn't know how they would normally treat me, but I do think that probably in some cases, like once they know that like I'm part Asian or whatever, they'll maybe react differently, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, totally. Thank you. Casey, how about you? Has this shown up at all, sort of as you've been growing up, and in what ways, and what was your reaction?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Sydney, for sharing about your experience. I also think that this question is very important, but first, I think it's important to address that the term anti-Asian sentiments or anti-Asian hate is such a simple word for something that is so complex, both historically and presently. I was talking about this question with my sister, and the first thing we thought about when I saw this question was, haven't we all in some way, experienced some sort of anti-Asian sentiment? I could talk about the multiple instances of microaggressions I experienced growing up from that probably a lot of us could relate to, from, being made fun of for my eyes or the way I looked, or, how smelly my food was, or the way I talked. It was almost like a rite of passage to go through this. And whether we acknowledge it or not, living in America as a person of color is a violent experience in itself that we must come to reckon with. And I think that this is indicative of somehow how normalized and ingrained in our society the anti-Asian sentiments have become. And so I guess to address or not address the question, I would say, yes, I have. And it's shocking and it's uncomfortable. And I don't think that I personally realized growing up the repercussions of these certain issues would have on a person growing up until I came to college and I became educated in Asian American studies and sociology, and realized that, my experience, hey, growing up, as an Asian American was vastly different than my white counterparts and even other minorities of color. And so, yeah, just to reiterate some of the points that are already made, I think it's just important to keep in mind this like complex identity that we all have growing up.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. It's interesting. I think in the last talk I shared, even myself growing up, a lot of the Asian people in my class in elementary school were actually foreign exchange students. And so teachers would ask me, oh, when did you move here from China? And at a young age, I can remember feeling uncomfortable by that question, but I don't think my teachers meant anything bad by it. But I think them not being educated and just assuming I was a foreign exchange student from China in and of itself had an impact on me when I was younger. So, but thank you for sharing that. Steve, what about you?
I mean, it's pretty similar. I mean, it's interesting to me because I think what Casey said is very true. Like, it's almost like it is like a rite of passage, because I think you would be hard to find an Asian person who hasn't felt at least experienced an uncomfortable question or an uncomfortable experience. It's interesting because when I read this question and I was thinking about it, there's it's really the whole spectrum, right? There's like the very racist, like, okay, you are clearly racist, right, kind of experiences. And then there's like those more like awkward, subtle ones. I think in a way those are even worse because you don't know the way to react, right? Someone, like, everything from someone attempting to they'll say my last name and they'll say, "Is that right?" And I'll be like, "Oh yeah, that's close enough." But how would you say it like in a Japanese accent? I was like, oh. Right?
Yeah.
Stuff like that, or people asking, the typical like, "Where are you from?" No, where are you really from? Kind of thing. It's like those more subtle things because the person isn't outwardly racist. Like, they're not trying to be hurtful, right? They believe that their intentions are good, and I think those are the harder experiences, to actually deal with. But so yeah, I mean, without going into specifics, and I don't think there really is a need to, because because everything I would say, I'm sure everyone else has experienced. It's a much more complex question than I initially thought, which was just like, oh yeah, I've dealt with that, but it's just like the different styles and almost the different flavors of it that I'm kind of almost fascinated by, because it's so deeply ingrained into the culture. right? That any Asian person can say, oh yeah, I've gone through that.
Yeah, unfortunately. Kind of a follow-up to that, and this one we're just going to keep open, so anyone can answer. But it's a follow-up question to that, and I think when we as humans experience hate, whether it's intentional or unintentional, I think our hope is that over time, the person that's inflicting that will either learn or want to learn or listen or discuss it more and evolve over time. Do you think your views have changed in terms of how you would have dealt something maybe 15, 20 years ago to how you might deal with it, when you were a child, to how you would deal with it now? Meaning, like, one example was, some people said, well, 10 years ago, I would never have said anything. I would just sort of, like, if someone asked me where I'm from and I, like where I'm really from, I just kind of like, haha, laugh it off. But now I actually want to engage with them in a discussion on why that's kind of a weird question. And so do any of you sort of feel like you've changed in the way that you respond to these types of things?
I can jump in. Yeah, I think so, definitely. I mean, like I mentioned before, growing up and like being able to be having the privilege to be educated, first of all, and gaining like the tools and resources to recognize like the kind of position I was in and also the ways to combat these certain issues. I think that I'm very grateful for, because that's taught me a lot about confrontation, about de-escalation, about handling myself in certain situations where I might be in danger and violence. So I think I just feel very, I guess, privileged to be able to understand and look at the world the way I do, especially with a Buddhist mindset. However, I do also want to address like what I want to see from others, because I think, of course, like we would hope that others share our view of the world as Buddhist, to see like, essence of all oneness, of all beings and all life. However, I do think that holding others to that expectation and placing a burden on everyone else to change is un-Buddhist in itself. And so, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I can kind of build on to that. Yeah, I think like, it's always a tricky thing to navigate, like especially addressing insensitive questions and turning it into a teachable moment. And so probably growing up, like I always wanted to just like escape the interaction as quickly as possible. Like I'm pretty anti-confrontational. And so, just wanting to like answer and leave. And I do think that that is like totally valid of a reaction, especially, as a woman, like somebody that it could potentially be very dangerous to kind of push back in certain situations. So I definitely think like even now, like the context totally matters, and like if the situation is safe and if I feel like it can turn into a teachable moment without just being like polarizing, then I think I would more readily now engage in sort of like explaining why that question is insensitive. And
Yeah, I actually give given this question like a lot of thought. So I apologize for the long answer in advance. So I think that it's a good question, because I think as JAs, and I hope people can understand what I'm saying when I talk about this, it's like, it's a very, we're kind of passive aggressive, you know what I mean? And I think it's because we're taught to not rock the boat. And I really think that this is kind of something that trickled down from Japanese culture. There's this whole concept of law, which is like a harmony thing, right? I think that's why when you go to Japan, you notice a lot of people just kind of keep to themselves. There's not like, if they see someone doing something bad, they're not going to say, hey, what are you doing? And I think it has to do with the fact that, there's a higher value put on the harmonious relations within a group over the individual's needs, right? Whereas the opposite here, right? And so this concept kind of works in a culture where everyone will follow suit, right? For better, for worse, right? But that's because you're less likely to encounter confrontation in that kind of environment, right? But since the US isn't like that, because of that, even it's ingrained in us culturally, but that also means that we're less equipped to deal with those, right? At least from a cultural sense. So to answer your question, like whenever these incidents would happen, I would kind of just stay silent and like Sydney said, try to get out of that situation as fast as possible. But then I would personally, like I would internally almost chastise myself for seeing these incidences as, well, why didn't I say something? Why am I being weak? Why am I just letting them take advantage of me? That kind of thing, right? And you tell yourself, oh, I'm just going to turn the other cheek. I'm just going to be the bigger person, but it doesn't feel like the right type of reaction. For me, so to answer your question, like, how do I deal with it now? I really try to look at these experiences more as an opportunity to improve myself internally, right? To become a better person and to increase empathy, right? Now, that can manifest itself in different ways. I mean, some people might just want to listen more. Some people might want to take more of an activist role. But I think it all has to start with internal work so that you don't add to the ignorance around you, right? And I know that sounds like super cliche and like something out of a self-help book, but I really believe it because to me, it really touches on almost like parts of like, it reminds me of like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Where you kind of identify the fact that a lot of stress, ignorance, and other psychological problems are based on, in part at least, unhelpful ways of thinking or unhelpful behavior patterns, right? So when you're given these opportunities that can put a spotlight on your own faulty or unhelpful ways of thinking or unhelpful behavior patterns, I think we should take advantage of them, right? So, and obviously it's easier said than done. But when I was kind of looking into this topic, and I was on Google, I found this article by Bishop Eric Matsumoto of the Honpa Honganji, and he mentions this quote by Shinran where he says, like, I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember the exact quote, but he basically says that you need to cast off the evil in this world and stop doing bad things, right? This is what it really means to, live in the Nembutsu, right? And so, when you hear these kinds of things and you're younger, I think you just take it as concepts, right? And I think one of the harder parts of Jodo Shinshu is, for me personally, I was struggling with where are places in my life that I can actually apply these concepts, right? I mean, it's hard enough to understand the concepts, but then finding opportunities to actually put them into my life is a lot harder. So I think this is one of those opportunities, right? I mean, as difficult it is, I think these are one of those opportunities. And so I know it's really kind of obvious to say when I say, oh, you need to work on yourself and stuff like that. But I really think that we need to remind ourselves that the parameters of one's reality are set by your thoughts and your emotions, right? And so if that's the case, then taking the time to at least be conscious of that fact, I think you can kind of it's kind of like equivalent to like when you start to get mad, you count to 10. You just remind yourself in the moment what's going on. And if you identify the fact, this is an opportunity for me to learn and become a better person, even though that's like well understood generally, I think it's important in those moments where those opportunities arise that you remind yourself, whether it's internally or even out loud, if that's what it takes to do so.
Yeah, these are all really great points, and I think it shows that I think all of us on this Zoom want to be able to evolve and learn from situations, but also educate people, which is a good thing. Because the other thing, which I think you touched on, Steve, which is a really important point, is that what I'm seeing is as I'm looking at younger generations of Japanese Americans or Buddhists, I feel like people, there's that phrase, are becoming more of an upstander, not so much of a bystander. And I think that's important because there are so many great things about our culture in harmony and, get everybody kind of getting along and not making waves. There's also something to be good for standing up for what's right and being an ally and supporting. And so I'm glad to hear all of that. So thank you for your guys' answers there. I'm going to pause very quickly and just remind folks on that are watching through the YouTube live, that if you have a question, now would be a good time to enter that into the chat and it will be forwarded to us. If any of those, as those come through, I will go into our next question, which again, anyone feel free to answer as we go through this. In our discussion today, we've been talking a lot about how actions, whether it's hate or not, might show up in maybe obvious or less obvious ways. People may not always mean to do them or have intent to harm people. What are some of those ways in your mind? Like, what are some of the downstream impacts of that happening if this isn't discussed? So if people remain silent and don't discuss these things, what can happen? And I know, like Sydney and I, we've talked about the arts, and there's other ways as well. So I'd love to hear your guys' viewpoints on that. And then, yeah, anyone can go first.
I can jump in. So yeah, great question. The way I kind of interpret this question was kind of through the lens of like media and media representation, if that makes sense. I think also that it's important that we talk about being specific, me being specifically a woman of Asian descent and the intersection of gender and race, and how we face stereotypes and misconceptions that may harm us in different ways than our males of Asian descent. Because as we know, like America does have a deep history of exoticization and fetishization of Asian American women over media sources. Because, you know, as Asian American female characters began emerging in the 19th century, they encountered a very strict limit on what narratives they could represent, from, you know, the sexual and the mysterious dragon lady to the docile and submissive lotus blossom. And I think in turn, this has affected both the ways that Asian Americans see themselves and how they are perceived by other groups. And I think the downstream effects of not addressing this and not, you know, realizing more has, as we know, very drastic effects that can lead to such violence as the Atlanta shootings, where a white man killed 8 people, 6 of whom were of Asian descent, women of Asian descent, and blamed it, you know, on a bad day and a sexual. And so I think we really can't ignore those axes of class, race, gender, and power at play here. And just really address that false representation or lack of representation in the media contributes to misconceptions and fallacies about Asian American women and the Asian American as a whole. And it also has just larger implications as they foster, I don't know if I just broke up, my internet said a little bit unstable, but as they foster and promote prejudice through anti-Asian bias. And I think, you know, as a community, we really need to stand up for ourselves and realizing this, and just really be sure we ourselves as a community aren't perpetuating those same tropes.
Kind of jumping on what Casey just said is, I think it makes it even worse because of the fact that technology is where it is, right? So that these incidences of like fetishization and stuff like that become more normalized because there's more sources for it. And I think that because of that too, because there's more sources and more incidents of it, it becomes normal to the point where people are more hesitant to speak up about it, right? In fact, I think it unfortunately takes on a almost like, specifically in like the arts, it's like a, oh well, isn't that good, right? It's like, you know, that movie Crazy Rich Asians, right? They say like, oh, this is the first 100% Asian ensemble in like 25 years, and it's like, oh, good for you. And it's like, yeah, but it shouldn't be like that, right? It shouldn't be seen as like, oh well, finally this is a great thing. It's like, this should be normal, right? And I think you know, what I thought of too, outside of that, when I was thinking about the answer to this question, was obviously the model minority thing, right? And I think that you know, when that was first stated, like I didn't even understand what it was. Like I actually had to look into it. And you know, my personal interpretation of it is, it's almost as if the Japanese American community, especially, I think, is susceptible to that, the model minority thing, right? Because I think when you look at the past and you think of like the internment camps, right? I think that there was obviously I wasn't there, but there was, I'm sure there was a mentality of, you know, we have to show that we're good citizens, right? That we're patriots and stuff like that. So, you know, obviously, you know, the 442nd and everything like that. I think it's a good example of like how the kind of like strength and hard work ethic that we had, you know, before and after the camps. But I think because of that, you know, we're almost more susceptible to be used in part of that myth, right? To say like, well, look, they worked hard, they're successful. Why can't you, other communities of color, why can't you do the same thing, right? So I think that is like something that exists to this day. You know, I saw a video where like one of the congressmen from California, Tom McClintock or something, that was saying, oh, you say that California is racist, well, look at all these Asians that are so successful. And it's like, okay, that's horrible, right? So I think this is like a perfect example of what happens when it kind of like, it's not talked about, you know, it's not brought up, the spotlight isn't put on it, right? It gently kind of weaves itself into policies and culture and stuff like that in a way that it isn't as blatant, you know, and so it's just seen as, oh yeah, that's normal, you know. So I know those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this question is so important to discuss, and Steve and Casey, those are like really excellent responses. I think for me, like recently I've been doing some, I guess, some self-reflection, I guess, along with Steve. And you know, one thing I have noticed is like myself kind of self-censoring certain aspects of my Asian and Buddhist upbringing. So, like for example, throughout grad school, I kind of realized that I was leading with like, oh, I'm an occupational therapist, and you know, not mentioning that I'm Buddhist because it's just too hard to explain. And this is really kind of like my whole experience growing up in school. It's just like my life in church and then temples is like one aspect, and it's so like separate delineated from my experience like outside of the church community. And I feel like this kind of goes back to like what Casey was explaining about the importance of like representation and like fighting back, like, or I guess like resisting or reshaping some of those stereotypes and assumptions. You know, because like if I was to tell people in school that I go to a church, of course, at first they would assume Christian church, and then I'm like, oh no, I'm Buddhist, and they're like, oh, so you're Zen, or like, oh, you're a monk, or like why do you eat meat? You know, so there was all these kind of stereotypes to fight against, and so ultimately I was just like, oh, it's too much trouble. I'm just going to like put that aside and not actually like embrace it as part of my identity. So I do think that like these downstream effects of that, like for me, I realized like there was a moment where I was like, I don't know where Buddhism fits into my life. Like professionally, it doesn't fit in. It seems to almost like prevent like certain or like as a therapist, for example, like if I was like, oh, I'm Buddhist as well, then there's almost kind of like a conflict of interest because it's like a religious thing, right? And so so I do think that that is really harmful, and like it's also me erasing important aspects of my culture and identity too. So yeah, I have more thoughts on that, but we can keep going.
You can share those thoughts. I think it's, yeah, I mean, I'm like you, Sydney. I literally as recent as like a week ago, somebody said, oh, you know, what religion are you? And I said, I'm Buddhist. And they said, oh, you're going to have to teach me how to meditate. And I was like, that's what? And then in that same conversation, I had referenced, you know, the church as a Buddhist church. And they said, you can't use church with Buddhism. Those don't go together. And we got into this big discussion of why. And then I was like, why am I having to defend myself? It was
Yeah.
pretty frustrating, but also like felt normal, like to have that discussion, right? Like, is, you know, which is maybe not a great thing, but yeah, feel free to share more of your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I think like for me, like my mom and my grandma, like everyone uses the terminology church, and like, you know, we grew up going to church, Sunday school, and like that to me has like this nostalgic feeling of like, oh, going to church. So church to me is not, I don't think like I don't reference a Judeo-Christian tradition. It's really like BCA church, and so I really actually like continue to like I'm trying to kind of keep that in my vocabulary, because I feel like if for me if I'm like, oh, I don't want to say church because people assume I'm Christian, like actually, you know, having this discussion of like, oh no, let me explain why it's called church, like let me explain like the history of BCA and you know, our patterns of assimilation, and like and why that we created something that is a unique Buddhist church. You know, like we are Buddhist churches of America, and like this is so like such a symbol of resilience to me, and also something like a refuge for my family. You know, and so I think having that discussion and explaining it rather than just like sitting and kind of reinforcing these assumptions that like church equals this. You know, it's like, oh no, we can be a church too, and like this is like you know, this is a possible like community of Buddhists, and like this, you know, we are Buddhists as well. So
Right.
yeah,
I mean, it was like the fact that someone was telling me I can't use the word church with relation to Buddhism. I was like, who says? You know, yeah. And then we got into this. I was saying all the things that you're saying, Sydney.
yeah,
So yeah, I really appreciate that.
yeah.
Yeah. Kind of going off of that same theme, we do have a question here. I'm just gonna I'm just going to read it. So we don't all handle hate. Actually, we kind of answered that one already, so I'm going to go to the next one. So if racism and hate is a systematic problem, which I think in some ways we've touched on, it can be, then somehow we need to fix the system as well as our personal reaction to it. As Buddhists, and with the influence on Buddhism within our lives, what possible policy or cultural changes do we think we could make or should make? Not meaning like you as an individual are going to change this in the world, but if it were up to you, what do you think you would change? Give everyone like a minute to think about. Oh, go ahead, Sydney.
Yeah, I'm happy to share. Yeah, I think that this is this question to me kind of goes back to what you were explaining before about like unintentionally contributing to anti-Asian sentiment. And so, for me, like when people like with good intentions, talk about ways to make the temples more, I guess, mainstream or more inclusive or like more palatable to the general audience. And if these kind of policy changes or I guess initiatives, if those includes things that will kind of downplay maybe some of the cultural aspects of our temples, to me personally, like I think that is very telling as to like what we view as something that's trendy or mainstream in America, as like, in America, right, like something that is the most successful model, society tells us that is something without cultural significance or without like heavy religious influence, and so there's all these kind of like this model of like assimilation. And so for me, I think that like kind of, contributes to this idea that like something that is ethnic or something that is culturally based is something that is like not as like, contemporary or like not as like I guess successful, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I kind of I would like, I mean, for me personally, I mean, given the fact that I also greatly value a lot of the cultural kind of recreational like things at the temple, like taiko, for example, like I would be sad to see those things go away.
Yeah, and I'm with you on all that, Sydney, and but I would just add my two. Like, it's really hard for me because when I think about, I also play taiko, and I also have studied, Japanese classical dance as well. And when I think about like the balance between wanting to change or adapt the art forms to make them be able to continue on and have new audiences and new interested people, but then how do you do that and not let go of what is really important to that cultural aspect? Whether it's like, when do we swing the pendulum too far into making it something that's no longer has the cultural relevance that it or meaning that it could or should? And I don't have the answer to that, but it's something that worries me a lot specifically with our cultural arts.
Yeah. It's such a interesting discussion and something that I think we'll all continue to have, for probably forever. But I do think it's so helpful to kind of hear from other people, like what is important to them, and like what would be sad to lose, because I don't think we will, like, we'll never really understand like what the value of something is until we have these conversations of like what is important to people.
Yeah. I agree. Thanks, Sydney. Steve or Casey, anything?
I was just thinking about like what Sydney just said, and it occurred to me that like we just don't have those conversations. I think the balance that you just mentioned, that's like the impossible question, right? Yeah. It's like, do you stick to the traditions that you always have, just like kind of dig your heels in and go, we're not changing anything ever, right? Because I think this is just an observation that I just had, so I might be totally ignorant when I'm saying this, but for other Asian cultures, I think specifically for the Japanese culture, it's not as if we have lots of people coming over from Japan, and so the population, Japanese population in the US isn't steadily growing. And even if it was, Japanese American culture is very different from Japanese culture, right? And so I think that kind of makes uh, Japanese American culture kind of different from other Asian cultures, right? And I'm generalizing here, so I'm sure that there's other Asian cultures that are kind of in the same situation. But I think because of that, it's like it's hard, right? Like I think as a culture, we're our history is kind of a mix of the traditions and the assimilation, right? And so it's a very, very difficult situation, I think, for us. And it's a conversation that I'm surprised that we haven't had more like sooner, right? Because I think that, like you said, if you swing the pendulum too far towards let's just do traditional, you might not attract new people that are interested, right? And then on the other hand, if you swing it too far the other way and it gets so diluted that you lose the original members, right? Because they're like, well, this isn't what it used to be. I feel like this is totally changed. I'm out of here, right? And I think a lot of these things we take for granted because, like, I mean, for me, like, I grew up in San Jose, Japantown, right? I grew up going to church and stuff like that. I never really questioned, like, well, who's kind of keeping track of like the traditions, who's keeping track of like what it should be, right? You just kind of take these things for granted. And I feel like if we don't have a conversation about it, it's going to happen on its own, right? Like it's like the loudest voice in the room wins, right? So whoever, whether it's one way or the other, I think we need to have wherever it ends up, we have to have control over it collectively, right? If we don't, I think we're just going to lose it.
Yeah, that's you actually captured what I've been thinking so nicely in that you said like the loudest voice in the room wins. And I think that's what worries me is sometimes the loudest voice isn't always the voice that's taking into consideration all the things that we're talking about. And even linking back to what we started off with, even with good intent, sometimes people can really drive things down a hole. So yeah, those types of things definitely worry me. Casey, do you have any? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Sydney and Steve. Those were like great answers. And I think this goes back to Steve, your point before about how important internal work is, and as well as like interactional work with those around you. When I kind of thought of this question about, exactly like institutional hate and racism being systemic and how what policy and cultural changes we need to make, I thought of like more like the larger issue. And I want to be very clear when I say this because I know that the term can often become like supercharged and heated, but I do believe that the Buddha would be an abolitionist because radical empathy, I think, is so important to the sustainment of human decency, and it's often a factor that is too soon forgotten when interacting with each other. And I think that Buddhism shows us this. It puts us all on the same level. You're not better than I am not better than you. Buddhism teaches us kind of an awareness of not only ourselves, but also the world around us. And I think we really do need to understand the very complex history that has come to shape our experience as Asian Americans in America. And I think as well, on the other hand, I do think as a community that exists within America, we also have to acknowledge that America is built off of white supremacy, built on stolen land, and it's built off of the Black men and women. So this is also an obstacle that we need to address in order to achieve our own peace and the peace of others around us. And so just to continue with that, I think that as Buddhists should question ourselves and whether or not we support institutions and legislation that historically has diminished people of color, particularly Black Americans, such as the police, such as ICE detention, as well as like the multitude of other factors that affect employment, housing, healthcare, just so many political power and education, and so much more. And so just to kind of like round out that answer, I think that Buddhism or the Dharma as a whole can be used to our social world and our inner world, because when you feel passion with such kindness, it's impossible to dependent on your own and how your place is also affected by those around you.
Yeah, no, that's so true. Yeah, it's like I actually, as I'm hearing all of you talk, I'm like, I feel like we're just getting started, and I realize we only have like 10 minutes left. Like the time flew by. But we do have time for one more question. And again, I just wanted to thank everyone for sharing all of your thoughts. So the last question is, I feel, a really important one, and it has to do with allyship. And this has come up a couple times in our questions and discussion, but again, it's that whole, how are we upstanders, not bystanders? But how do we as Buddhists work together, or can we work together with other minority groups to promote solidarity against racism or hate, whether it's seen or not seen, and or what would we expect to see from others to us? Interested to hear your guys' thoughts on, or all of your thoughts on that.
Okay, I can start, I guess. Yeah, yeah, this is a really good question. All these questions are really good. I think that I love how we're talking quite a bit about a Buddhist lens and kind of self-reflecting on ways that ways our perspectives are limited in many ways, and how our Bonbu nature not really always knowing all the sides of the story. And so for me, especially as a therapist, more recently, I've been reflecting on kind of my own internalized need to want to fix things or to kind of save other people, and kind of reflecting on that internalized colonialist mindset. And so I do think when working with other minority groups, it is important to kind of to go in with this humility and to really to really support through following them, right? I think each community kind of knows their own struggles and knows kind of what their community needs. And so for us, I think it could be really important to support their events and their fundraisers, and I would hope that they do the same to us. I would love to see more people come to our spaghetti dinners and pancake breakfast, right? And just kind of supporting the initiatives that we already have going on. And Obon, I think we see that a lot with Obon, a lot of community support. And so, yeah, I think that I like this. I think it's really important that BC churches and how that we're able to be who we are, authentically and kind of unapologetically in many ways. And I think that other minority communities, I wish for them the same, for them to be who they are and to worship who they want and to be whatever culture resonates with them. So.
That's awesome.
I think this is a really difficult concept because when I was thinking about this question, it's really hard because how best to be an ally to others. I think first, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I think it's you have to start with internal work, right? And specifically, I think you need to, it's almost get your own house in order before you start helping other people cleaning up their houses. And so then I think it's important for all of us to do that, right? And I think it's harder too, because when you look at the history of Jodo Shinshu too, right? I mean, the reason why this sect of Buddhism was so popular is because it was available to the masses, right? And there's this whole the concept, and I'm sure that I'm misquoting or or something here, but the whole concept of well, we're flawed beings, we're ignorant individuals, and then when we go to the Pure Land, attain enlightenment, it's kind of guaranteed. So, but then it's interesting because I was looking into it. I think Shinran actually addresses where he says so then why wouldn't someone who just wants to go out and steal and stuff, why wouldn't they just do it then, right? And he says that's not really the point. Our job isn't to make other people better, right? You want to be compassionate, but you don't do that by forcing Nembutsu into other people's lives, right? And so when I read that whole passage, I was kind of okay, so if I see bad stuff happening, do I just say, okay, well, that's how that person is, right? And but I in a way, I almost think that's the point, right? Is that if you let yourself in that moment see someone doing something bad, it's very easy for you to go down that slope of being prejudiced, adding to your own internal racism. And so again, I think this is like an opportunity. And I think the best way for us to be allies to other communities of color is to work through our own prejudices, our own kind of like how we see those groups, right? Because the fact of the matter is this is the US, and there's a high value placed on success, wealth, and stuff like that. And so the way that the system is all set up is, I think we're almost, without us even being aware of it, we're kind of like pitted against each other, right? Like, how well is your community doing? How well is your community doing? Oh, it almost stretches into like individual communities inside the same community. Oh, how successful was your Obon? How successful was yours, right? So I think that like we have to kind of be aware of that, right? And kind of be when we say like compassion, right? Infinite compassion and stuff like that. Again, this was a concept that just kind of like went over my head when I was younger. I was like, okay, I got it. The Buddha is infinite, like infinitely wise, infinitely compassionate. Got it. This is a good thing to strive for. But like when you really go really deep into it, I mean, I think I understand better now what that means, right? If you are truly compassionate, right, towards yourself, towards those in your group, how can it not but add to the positivity of the world around you? Like you can't be infinitely compassionate inwardly and be totally ignorant outwardly, right? I think there's kind of an effect of working on yourself, working through all the kind of prejudices and internal racism that you have. And then just by that effect alone, it'll make you a better person and make you a better ally to those around you. So that when you meet someone from another group, you won't jump to quickly assume that you know them or their culture or who they are or how she acts or something like that, right? You'll come into it more with like that humility and an open ear, and not just quickly assume to know that person's situation and how they act and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very well said, both of you. I think, honestly, I have nothing to add. And since we're running out of time, I just think both the points about, Steve, your point about, how we need to address internal work, and also, Cindy, you said we need to, make sure, how do we center and uplift other communities that we're interacting with? I think an important part of this is just, I guess, recognizing and dealing with perhaps past trauma. I think especially for the Japanese American community, how do we recognize and or deal with our past internment camps and incarceration, and further, how can we use that experience to make sure it never happens again? I think a group that does this especially well is Studio for Solidarity, which is a grassroots organization that uses the incarceration experience to fight for migrant families and immigrant communities. So I think we can all learn everyone. And just like one final point is, I think no matter what, Buddhism also guides us in remembering, no matter how angered or frustrated or restricted we current oppression or the current system, that we just keep in mind that that end goal is peace and unity and oneness. And I think that Buddhism and the teachings of the Buddha can really help us practice this and envision this. So yeah, thank you.
That's awesome. I also would have literally nothing to add to any of your answers. And I think if I were to add my own, it kind of adds to what you all said is, I want to make sure that we, and I think I'm also sounding like a broken record, I want to make sure that we as a culture, as a religion, stand up and speak up. That doesn't mean that we're fighting back, but it means that we're not remaining silent. And if we're in a situation where we're not feeling great about whatever's happening, that we don't pretend to be okay with it. So in whatever way that makes sense for people, I hope that we can be more vocal. All right, well, that brings us to the end. Before we close, though, I do have a quick lightning round. So we'll go Casey, Steve, Sydney. So I'll ask the question, and then you each in that order have to answer really quickly. So you guys can come off mute. Maybe it'll be easier. Then you won't have to mute and unmute. Okay. So the first one, so I'll say 2 words, and you just choose the one that comes to your mind first. So the first one is movies, comedy or action?
Action.
Action.
Comedy.
Okay. Summer or winter seasons?
Summer.
Winter.
Winter.
I was wondering if someone was going to say fall. Just to try.
No, fall really.
Or spring. Okay, next one is Korean barbecue or ramen?
Ramen.
Oh man, ramen.
Ramen, yeah.
Oh no, I was gonna say Korean barbecue.
I was torn. I was torn.
Yeah.
Last one is boba or coffee?
Coffee.
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 I'm so different than everyone else.
Coffee's a necessity.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I get it. Well, thank you again to all of you for joining us, and to San Jose Betsuin for hosting this or hosting these discussions. But it was really great for me to talk to and hear from each one of you. And as I said, I think we could probably have gone on forever, but we know that folks are getting screen fatigue in this pandemic that we are still in. So we will end here. But thank you all for your time and your answers and joining in on the discussion.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much.
So since Rinban Sakamoto went out for service, so on behalf of Betsin, so I'd like to express my gratitude to coordinator Matt, Ogawa, and Sydney, Casey, and Steve. That was very meaningful conversation for me to rethink of our relationships in this community and society, and our reactions and behavior toward anti-Asian issues in the Buddhist standpoint. Thank you for your participation. Okay, so I'd like to conclude this program with Gassho. If you wouldn't mind, please join me in Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda Butsu. Namanda Butsu. Thank you very much. Stay safe and have a wonderful weekend. Bye.